Welcome to the wonderful world of wine, exploring all things wine-related with you. We are your hosts, Kim Simone and Mark Lindsay, and you can find us on Facebook at The Wonderful World of Wine.
Hello, Kim. Excited to talk wine with you today. First topic we found was an article about pairing wine with nuts. Social vignerons. Is that how you say it?
Vigneron.
Vignerons. It's a
those
blog.
French G's in there can get pretty tricky.
You're better at the pronunciation than I am. So overall, this article was a wine pairing article, but it also had some good suggestions about pairing as a perfectionist or a whimsical pairing. So what did you think of the approach first on the pairing?
I thought it was a nice approach. You know, not only are we talking about sort of the basic rules of pairing food and wine, but then they got into the nitty-gritty of pretty specific food category. But I think that people who like to drink wine with their food do sort of fall into those two categories. There are some people very specific about, oh, you only should drink this with this, and this goes with this, and yada, yada, yada. Or, you know, there's the people who just kind of drink what they like with the foods that they like and just kind of go with whatever they have. What category do you fall in?
Well, to me, it's all about trying to find the best way. A perfectionist, they were saying, with like to find the perfect match. I think you have to just experiment to find the perfect match. And this article had me thinking, you know, I've never honestly sat down and had nuts with wine. Have you?
I have, actually. And this article sort of triggered in my mind a tasting that I did over the summer at the Boston Public Market, where we were pairing local wines and local cheeses. And then there was all this other stuff that kind of had to go on the plate. So I had to do a fair amount of research into, okay, which wine should I put almonds with? Which wine should I put pecans with? Which, you know, and all of these other things, pickled onions and jams and pickles and sorts of stuff like that. So this reminded me a little bit of that procedure and having to do a whole bunch of research about, you know, what wines actually do go with these kinds of nuts. I don't want to make a really poor pairing, but I think there's so much room for just experimenting and trying things out. And sometimes those really good matches don't follow the rules and you're totally surprised. So I kind of like that about the experimental part of pairing wine and food.
So in the article, they mentioned elements to consider. So did you consider the acid or the bitter or the fats or the salt or texture of the nuts?
Totally.
Like they were saying in this?
Yeah, like the idea of putting a lighter nut like a cashew with a lighter wine. For me, that makes total sense. And what I found interesting was the emphasis on tannins, because you don't usually have a lot of food that has a lot of tannic structure, but nuts are totally one of those things that does. So often when you're pairing a high tannic wine with food, you're not so worried about, oh, the other food has a lot of tannin too. I have to be careful about what I pair this high tannic wine with because you don't want too many tannins in there. But nuts really are one of those foods that you do have to take that into consideration.
And they also were talking about the preparation of the nuts. It could be a roasted nut, it could be a salted nut.
Right, just like with any food. You know, if you're doing a barbecued chicken, that's going to be heavier and can stand up to a heavier food as opposed to if you're doing a poached chicken, which is so much lighter, and you don't want to overwhelm that with a heavy red. So preparation method, it does not surprise me that would be something that you would need to take into consideration for nuts as well. So roasted nuts, you know, can boast something a little bit heavier, whereas something that's unsalted, raw, a little bit lighter, you want to stick to something lighter.
And they were talking about complementary and contrast in pairings. And we fight about this a lot because how we always pair up things, we have a different view, but I think they all work. So it basically was this. It's either a balanced pairing or counterbalanced pairing.
Right. So you're either looking for flavors and textures that are complementary to each other. A high acid wine with a high acid food. That's why Chianti and spaghetti sauce go so well together. Or you want to do opposites, which also work, like a spicy curry with light white wine that has some sweetness to it so that the sugar and the heat balance each other out.
50 different nuts in the world. 50.
I couldn't think of 50.
Yeah. And interesting though, I didn't see peanut in this article, right? So one of my go-to nuts is the peanut. And I was thinking, have you ever had a wine or opened a bottle of wine and you taste it and the first thing you think is this is a grapey wine?
Yes.
It's just overpoweringly
grapey.
Grape, right? So I was thinking, okay, one of these grapey wines.
Oh, you're going with good jelly and peanut butter,
jelly,
aren't you?
Right? So see, you didn't even think of it. I
didn't even think about that.
Yeah, peanut butter and jelly. And there's just sometimes you have just like an unoaked, maybe Tempranillo or something from Spain, and the first blast you get is just grape juice, right?
It's all fruity.
And now I'm thinking peanut, right?
Interesting.
Also, well, they didn't talk about, say, like a tawny port with a nut.
And that's my usual go-to.
Right? So
absolutely is. Because those wines have such nutty aromas and nutty flavors to them. This kind of goes back to that. You're doing contrasting or you're doing complementary. So if you've got a nutty wine and you've got a nutty nut, that's that classic complementary flavors and aromas that are going on there. So that's a perfect pairing.
Yeah, so no mention of tawny port.
I was a little surprised by that.
Anything
Madeiras and
anything
sherries
nutty
and all
profile,
those things.
which I would think was a perfect pairing for most nuts. I don't know the 50, but they did mention maybe 5 or 6. Did you talk about walnut?
Walnuts because they're really tannic.
They said Pinot Noir now
which makes
for a
sense.
walnut.
Because if you have, say, a Shiraz that's really tannic and you're putting it with a tannic nut, you're just going to be overwhelmed by tannins. Whereas if you pair it with a Pinot Noir that might be a little bit lighter on the tannins, it might work a little bit better.
What did you think about the other? They had pistachio cashew with a Sauvignon Blanc or a Pinot Grigio.
I just did this the other day, actually.
We
were drinking a Sauvignon Blanc at home, and I was eating pistachios, and my husband was eating cashews. And they both went pretty well, but they made the wine taste very different.
Bitter?
No, not bitter. Just the wine tasted a certain way when I was drinking it with the pistachios, and it tasted a certain way when I was drinking it with the cashews. So like with the pistachios, it really brought out that sort of green vegetal note. You know, pistachios are green and can have sort of almost like a green flavor. It brought out those flavors in the wine, whereas the cashews didn't do that. And I thought that was very interesting.
Were they both salted nuts?
I'm trying to remember. I don't think the cashews were.
Because I would think the salt would overpower the
I don't
fruit.
think about salt all that much when I think about wine pairings.
So if you had a salty food in general or not, do you think you want a more acidic wine for the salt or more fruity?
Maybe you want more acidic so that it'll be more mouth-watering and you'll have more just, stuff going on in your mouth. I honestly don't think that I've ever thought about salt level in food and how that would impact what you're drinking with it.
I mean, there are some whites the grapes are grown near water sources that give them a little saline quality to them, but I'd never think of pairing it that way.
No, I totally.
But they did mention, as we said before in past food pairing suggestions, is when there was 50 different nuts around the world, pair it with a wine from the region the nut is from.
And this is advice that we give people a lot too. It's like if you don't know what to drink with what you're eating, well, where is that food from? Are you eating Italian food? Pair it with Italian wine. Are you eating...
So hazelnut, I think, is an Italian nut, correct? Due to Nutella, right?
I love Nutella.
And they paired it with Chardonnay and sparkling wine, so no Italian really. Well, you could use Italian wines. Unusual. Your bubbly friend there came up with hazelnut and almond nut.
And I almost feel like using the sparkling wine thing is a little bit of a cop out because sparkling wine goes with everything.
Yeah, it works with all of them. Yeah, nut could be an appetizer food, so it works well with sparkling. So, any other takes on any of the pairings they mentioned, or
and just that sort of as they moved up the scale to the heavier nuts, moving from those pistachios that are nice and light into something that's heavier like a pecan, you see the wines getting a little bit heavier too. So I think this is where that whole is it a roasted nut, is it not, comes into play. Whereas if you're doing more with the nut, if you're roasting it, sometimes you'll get like smoked nuts, things like that. Definitely pair it with something a little heavier.
Yeah, they did mention covered chocolate nuts. What's the other thing? Candied nuts, I would assume. You want a little sweeter wine to it.
Those are the things that would go well with port. Like I've done some pecans that have been coated in like a sugary syrup that actually has port in them. And this kind of goes back to that rule of if you are looking for a wine to pair with your food, try cooking with that wine just a little bit. Put a little bit of that in the dish and that'll bring the whole thing together. So this is an instance of that.
That sounds good. And getting back to the grapey with the peanut, it's the whimsical pairing, I'm
going to have to totally try that.
So try it out. Let us know. Get some peanuts and Kim and I will suggest a grapey wine and let us know what you think. Welcome back to the wonderful world of wine. We are your hosts, Mark Lindsay and Kim Simone, exploring all things wine with you. If you would like to get more information about myself, you can go to franklinliquors.com. If you'd like to get more information about Kim, you can go to vinitaswineworks.com.
Today, we are going to talk a little bit about when you are traveling for vacation and want to bring some wine back with you. What are the logistics of packing wine in your suitcase? Mark, do you often travel and bring wine home, or or do you just, get it all shipped here?
No, I basically drink it where I am.
I don't do a whole lot.
I don't think of it, but I do get a lot of questions about how can I ship it more than how can I pack it when I'm traveling. And I guess the take I took from this article was, when you go away, do you pack it yourself or do you buy it and let them ship it to you? So it's similar ways you have to think about how to pack it. So how about yourself? Do you?
The only time I've really ever done it was when we've traveled to Italy and we brought a few bottles back, special bottles like Vinsanto and some Brunellos and things like that. But it's not often something I do because we don't travel a whole lot. But I thought that this was pretty valuable information. Wine, if it breaks in your luggage, you've got a pretty big mess on your hands. So we do get this question every once in a while.
And the only option is you have to pack it in your checked luggage. So you know how that's, handled. So you treat it any way you would treat your other valuables you want to put in your checked luggage. I always have my go-to kind of thing to tell people about shipping is make sure it's wrapped and make sure it's concealed in some sort of baggie or bag that if it breaks, it's not going all over your clothes and you'll capture it in some sort of bag.
That's smart. So like a plastic bag, keep the bottle in a plastic bag.
Yeah, in case of breakage. So they were talking about suitcases in general, the structure of the suitcase, protecting the top and the bottom of the bottle. And they do sell some very expensive cases made specifically for wine. Did you see the movie Bottle
Shock?
Bottle Shock. It wasn't that. What was the movie about the tasting in Paris?
Yeah, it was Bottle Shock.
Bottle Shock? Okay. So the gentleman comes from France and he goes to California. He had to have people carry so many bottles apiece.
Right, because they wouldn't let him transport all of the wine himself. So he was handing out bottles to people on the airplane saying, "Will you carry these 2 bottles for me?" It was a pretty cute scene.
It didn't talk about if you're limited. How many bottles? I mean, if they open your case and it's filled with a case of wine, is there a limit?
That's what I was thinking too. And not only is there a legal limit to how much alcohol you can be bringing in on one trip, but the weight, because wine in glass bottles really heavy.
That's true.
So if you're going to be, thinking about packing a few bottles of wine or more in your checked luggage, you really need to think about how heavy are those bottles going to be.
Yeah, great point.
Even
you're
5 or 6 bottles.
So is it worth it? I mean, if it's a wine, it's not shipped to the state or to the country. It's worth grabbing some there. But I would definitely look at seeing if they ship it. Most of if you go to California, most of the wineries will gladly ship it to you. Let them take the insurance and that for the wine is my point of view on that. I always get nervous any shipping of wine, either a club or doing it yourself, just because you don't know what the heck, especially on a plane. You're talking altitude and temperature changes.
And the way that the luggage is handled, you do need to pay attention to the fact that you are shipping something that not only is it messy if it breaks open, but it's in a glass bottle. And certain parts of that glass bottle are more delicate than others. So one of the major takeaways I thought about this topic was protect the neck of the bottle, because if it's going to break, that's where it's going to break. So I thought that was really something smart to pay attention to if you are going to pack some wine in your luggage. Wrap each bottle carefully, build like a wall around the edges of your suitcase so that there's some protection there, and then really pay attention to that bottleneck.
How did you pack when you brought them back from Italy?
I think we rolled them up in sweaters.
So there was no baggie, no
I don't think
bubble wrap.
I don't think we did. We definitely didn't do bubble wrap, and I don't think we did plastic bags. I think we just wrapped them in our heaviest clothes.
So you got lucky.
Totally.
You got totally lucky. Well, we wish everybody good luck when you're doing it, but there are a lot of options, better cases, direct shipping. Tell us what you think.
Welcome back to the wonderful world of wine. We are your hosts, Kim Simone and Mark Lindsay. You can find Mark online at franklinliquors.com, and you can find me online at my company Vinitas Wineworks at vinitaswineworks.com. Today we're going to talk a little bit about alcohol levels in your wine and how they are labeled on the bottle. So what is interesting is that there's so much information for you on a wine bottle label that you just sort of take for granted. You see a grape variety, you expect that that's the grape variety that's in the bottle. You see the producer name, that that's the producer. But when you see the alcohol level, there's actually a plus or minus that is associated with that. So your wine might say it's 14%, but it could be more than 14%. It could be less than 14%. Do you ever have to explain this to customers, Mark, and get people to understand that there is a little bit of plus minus there?
I don't think customers really care about that geeky part of it, but you know what?
You think that's a geeky part?
Yeah, I think it's a geeky part. I mean, people want to look at the percentage. It's one of the 7 truths that have to be on the label. They must tell you the alcohol content. The winery is paying tax based on the alcohol level. So they also want to know, or the government also wants to know, if you're within that level, because they don't want you cheating on the tax payments. So this article, which was in VinePair, brought to light that they've done a study checking how that plus minus level is. So.
I thought that was interesting because I had never read anywhere before that there was actual research done on, okay, so your bottle might say 13.5%. Is it actually 13.5%? Is it more? Is it less? And this study found that most of them were about 0.5% higher than what was stated on the label, which I thought was very interesting.
And the standard for the government is if it's a 14% wine or below, the plus minus is 1.5%. If it's above 14%, the plus minus is 1% of error. So they did a study and they found an EU plus minus and a US plus minus, and it was within the standard government rate.
Right.
So I thought one of the things they did, like 100,000 wines too, they tested.
That's a lot of wines.
Which is a lot. I don't know how many the government, I don't see any stats on the TTB site of how they tested it, but I'm sure they're spot checking people frequently to get their money.
Well, really, I mean, if at the end of the day, what it's really coming down to is taxes, then sure, I'm sure the government is paying pretty close attention to this because they want to make sure that they're getting their fair amount of tax that they're supposed to.
The interesting part, if the article was saying, say your wine label says 13.9%, so that's under the 14%, so it can be up to 15.4% alcohol, and it's stated it's 13.9, so that makes a big difference.
That's a really big difference. That really could be the difference between a hangover the next day and not.
Yeah, so it brought to that, to me, was just astounding. There's no way for us to know what it is, but you should be aware there is a plus minus percentage. Lately, there's been this new tax reform in the news, and they are playing around with raising the tax rate on the wine. So I think now it'll be everything up to 16% is going to pay the same percentage. I think right now 14% and below is like 21 cents a bottle, and then at the higher rate above 14, it's higher. So now they'll all pay the same up to 16%. So we don't know how that will affect the plus minus level. Mm-hmm. So it'll be interesting to see what they do with that.
And this seems to be a smart change, given that these days grapes generally will attain higher ripeness, what with climate change and with summers and climate being a little bit warmer. Grapes don't really have to struggle all that often in too many places to get super ripe. So there's more potential alcohol in those grapes because they're higher in sugar. So it's easier for winemakers to make these higher levels of alcohol in their wines. So I think that this is probably a little bit of a response to that because we are seeing higher and higher alcohol levels. One thing that was mentioned in this article was that typically, so it was in the 1960s, Cabernets coming out of Napa were usually around 12 or 12.5%. Now Cabernets coming out of Napa are closer to 15.5. So there definitely has been this major change either in, the ripeness of the grapes, or technology has gotten a little bit better, or the environment is a little warmer, or winemakers are making these switches to produce wines that do have higher alcohol levels. So it's an interesting thing to keep an eye on.
Yeah, and if I always like to look at it from the point of the bigger producers of wine. If I'm making 1 million cases of wine and I'm paying tax on the alcohol level, Kim, would you make a wine at over 15% or over 16%?
Absolutely not.
Right?
Not if I have to pay higher taxes on
right,
that.
You're saving that money. So I'll always bring up it at events. I'll say, if you notice that a wine brand you've been drinking 10 years ago, the alcohol content is exactly the same today as it was 10 years ago. When you have all these factors where there's, in the industry, the levels are rising, but they are keeping them the same, and it's all, to me, based on tax money. Mm-hmm. So when you're drinking a bottle of wine, take a look at the label and that alcohol percent. And as Kim mentioned, that's usually 99% of the time the problem with your stay with the hangover is due to alcohol percent. So
stay hydrated.
You're listening to The Wonderful World of Wine. I am Mark Lindsay of Franklin Liquors. You can find me at franklinliquors.com. And my partner in wine is Kim Simone. And you can find information about her company, Vinitas Wineworks, at vinitaswineworks.com. Our next topic was from the Napa Valley Register, Keys to Fine Wine. And it was basically defining balance and structure in wine. Do you consider these geeky terms or understandings of wine?
I guess I do. do. I mean, if you're just looking for a yummy glass of wine to drink at the end of the day, you might not necessarily be thinking in terms of, oh, what is the balance of my wine? You just want something that tastes yummy. But for those of us that think about these things day in and day out, these are important topics to think about. I know for myself that paying attention to the balance of the wine is my number one thing that is going to make me feel this is a good wine or this is kind of a mediocre wine or maybe a bad wine. I don't know. I don't run into bad wines all that often.
Explain your definition of what a balanced wine would be.
So for me, a balanced wine is that there isn't one component of the wine that is overwhelming all of the other ones. So we're talking about things like acidity level. Is it too tart or does it taste just tart enough? The tannins. Is it overwhelmingly making your mouth dry out or is it a nice feeling? Alcohol level. When you drink it, does it make you feel like you've been eating spicy salsa because it's so hot on there, or does the alcohol just kind of have a warming effect and bring the whole thing together? So it's those components. Are they all working together? Or is there part of it that is maybe the alcohol is too high or there's too much sweetness or it's too tart? I used to describe wines that were kind of out of balance like this as having too many elbows. It was like they had one part that was, sticking out and kind of poking you, and it wasn't necessarily a pleasant thing. So for me, the balance is key. Are all those parts kind of playing nicely together, or is there something that is standing out and is kind of getting it off balance?
Yeah, many times when I say to someone it's a very balanced wine, I get a puzzled look because it is kind of a difficult thing to understand. It's almost the same thing as saying a perfect food and wine pairing, where when you have the pairing, you're not tasting too much of the wine, you're not tasting too much of the food. It just balances well together and nothing's overpowering. So I kind of compare it that way. They were saying there is no formula for making a perfect balanced wine, but there are factors that can affect the balance of a wine.
And it depends on the grape variety too. You've got some grape varieties so let's compare, say, a Pinot Noir and a Cabernet. You're not going to have the same structure with a Pinot Noir as you do with a Cabernet. And if you are looking for the same balance in one that's in the other, you're not going to find it because they're different. You can't look for a big tannic Pinot Noir because they're not out there, because it's just a grape variety that ends up being lighter. So if you are looking at it and saying, oh, this is too light because you want it to be a Cabernet, it's almost like you're looking in the wrong place. You need to assess them for what they are. What's the thing where if you judge a fish by how well it can climb a tree, it's always going to be a failure. It's like, well, if you judge a Pinot Noir by the tannic structure of a Cabernet, it's never going to live up to your expectations. So balance is different for not only each individual grape variety, but maybe the style that they're going for. So everything in it of its own, I suppose.
Yeah, that's the great thing about the wine world, just discovering or keep trying different things. And when you find a wine that is balanced, a lot of times it surprises you because it might be from a region where the climate you wouldn't think it would be balanced, but there's so many surprises. So let's talk about when they're talking about structure. What is that? What would you say? You don't hear it often.
You don't hear it. No, you don't. And usually when you hear about structure, somebody is really only referring to the tannins. Is it a structured wine? Is it a big wine? Is it a powerful wine? The tannins are what give red wines their body, their weight. It's what makes them feel substantial in your mouth. And the metaphor that the author used in this opinion piece I thought was really interesting, and I had never thought of it that way, is he said that the structure of the wine is, think about your body. So you have a skeleton, you have muscles, you have the skin on the outside of your body. Think about the different components that lead to the balance of a wine like that. So all wines need acidity, just like all living creatures need a skeleton. So think of the acids in the wine as the skeletal structure of the wine. And then you add on tannins, which are like your muscles. They fill out the form and they make it look the way that it's supposed to look or feel the way it's supposed to feel. And then the fruit and the flavors is like the flesh on the body, where now you see what it looks like and it gives it all this personality. So I thought that was such an interesting metaphor, and I hadn't thought of that before.
Yeah.
And it really works for me.
Basically, the balance gives the wine shape.
Yeah.
Which, like you're saying, I thought that was a very interesting thing as well.
And, we use this term flabby sometimes to talk about a wine that doesn't have a lot of acidity to it, and so it's out of balance that way. And it's like, okay, so you're taking away the skeletal structure. You totally can think about like a floppy, you don't have any skeletal structure in there, and it's just kind of flat and flabby. I'm like, yeah, that totally works.
Do you feel a lot of people don't sense a balanced wine? It's something that comes with experience?
I think it's something that comes with experience, with practice, and also with having tasted a lot of different things so that you can be able to put words to, okay, now I see why maybe that wine that I've been drinking a lot, and maybe it was something that you started out, or it was a big commercial wine that a lot of people are drinking. When you can finally compare that to something that's a little bit better and that does have that better balance to it, then you can go back and revisit those things that maybe you were drinking before and be like, oh, now I understand the difference between this is a little bit of a better bottle, this one maybe not so much, and now you can point out why. And I think it's also individual, which is one of the reasons why there is no set formula for this. You, as you drink wine, have different personal preferences than I do. So, like for an example, I prefer higher acid wines. So for me, a wine that has a little bit more acidity tastes more balanced, but that same wine might not taste as balanced for you because you don't like as high acid. So maybe you like more tannins, maybe you like more sweetness. So it's really hard for us to say at the end of the day, this is a better wine because this is better balanced, because the wine that I think has better balance, Mark might not think has better balance. And it comes down to that individuality.
Great point, because most of the time you give the acidity example, but the tannin example, you recommend a Cabernet. People expect that bitter, that tannin level of a cab, but if you have a cab that's just balanced with very balanced acid tannins, people might not like it because they're not used to that structure.
It might not, and it might not hit you over the head with wow, all this oak, or wow, all this tannic structure, which is what maybe they're expecting, and frankly, maybe what they like.
And I find it's very rare that I make a tasting or a taste of wine that I say this is very balanced, because it's more
rare,
typical.
Like, you don't find them terribly balanced, you mean?
Yeah, I rarely have wine note where I'll say this is perfectly balanced.
Oh, see, I write about balance all the time in my tasting notes.
I just don't. I don't find it, and I think it's either I want to stress the acidity or the tannins because I feel that's what a shopper is looking for.
Okay, that makes sense. So more like parsing out the different components.
Yeah,
of it.
if I said this has a nice body, it's a heavy body cab, that the finish is very tannic, or people will relate to that more than if I said it's a very balanced Cabernet.
Right. That makes sense.
So I kind of go with that. So let us know what you think about balance and structure. If you have any questions, reach out to us and we'll fight about it and explain how we can.
You've been listening to The Wonderful World of Wine with Mark Lindsay and Kim Simone. Thank you for joining us today. We can be found on Facebook at The Wonderful World of Wine. And if you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment on our page.
Wine.